The Indiana legislature has led the way in defunding tax dollars from Planned Parenthood, and since then several states have followed suit. But Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest promoter and provider of abortion, isn't going down without a fight. Stay with us to get all the details. This past spring, the Indiana State Senate voted to pass House Bill 2010, which would make Indiana one of the safest places in America for unborn babies. This year, Planned Parenthood of Indiana was to receive about $3 million in funding, but the new bill prohibited federal funds from going to the abortion facilities. I sat down with Indiana State Senator Scott Schneider, the author of the Senate amendment to the bill, to discuss its implications.
We certainly have state tax dollars that goes to fund organizations that perform abortion. That was cut off. The bigger issue is federal government, through other different types of organizations, will funnel money back to the states, and then they will funnel money to the service providers that are Medicaid providers. And it's clear that the law states that the state has the authority and the right whom to choose to be a vendor or who receives that tax money. In this particular case, our law, our amendment said no state agency or granting authority can grant or contract with any organization that performs abortion. Obviously in Indiana, the largest abortion provider both in Indiana and nationwide is Planned Parenthood. You know, is it proper to force taxpayers to subsidize the practice of abortion through their tax dollars? We just think that's fundamentally wrong, and so that's why you know, we introduced the amendment.
Well, part of the important piece of this equation, Senator, is the fact that you said the state legislature has the authority to decide where that money goes, and you seem very clear about that. Why are you so clear and determined that you have that authority?
Does the federal government have the authority to mandate to a state whom they contract with?
The 10th Amendment?
The 10th Amendment, exactly. Those powers not specifically granted to the federal government are left to the states. And so what I think we're going to see is a constitutional, this turn into a constitutional issue, and quite frankly, many have discussed the fact that this may even go to the United States Supreme Court.
Senator, it seems that you have public sentiment with you on this issue. Polling that I've seen seems to indicate that people do not want their tax dollars to fund organizations that are involved in providing abortion. Is that true?
People, regardless of what their opinion is on the abortion issue itself, have a clear opinion about whether their tax dollars should be going to fund abortion, even if they are supportive of abortion. And so I think public sentiment that we've seen in Indiana, at least, has been very strong with making sure, or at least expressing that sentiment that their tax dollars shouldn't be going to something that's so controversial.
When we return, we'll hear about Planned Parenthood and the ACLU's fight to stop the defunding bill.
Look around you. We're surrounded by people who courageously face difficult obstacles life has thrown in their paths. Tune in each week to meet people who show there are positive, godly solutions to tough, critical situations. This Emmy Award-winning show tackles challenging life issues such as abortion, stem cell research, and adoption, and shows every human life is valuable and precious. Join us for inspiring stories of people facing life head-on.
On the same day Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels signed House Bill 2010 into law, the ACLU filed an injunction on behalf of Planned Parenthood to block it. 3 of the 4 plaintiffs involved in the court hearing were employees of Planned Parenthood, including an abortionist. In July, U.S. District Judge Tanya Pratt, nominated by Barack Obama, ruled in favor of the injunction, putting the enforcement of the law on hold. Ken Falk, legal director for the ACLU of Indiana, is representing Planned Parenthood in their fight against the bill. He argues the law is unconstitutional and inconsistent with federal statutes.
What Indiana did in this case was take what we felt was an unprecedented and unlawful step to punish both women and Planned Parenthood for providing abortion services. This lawsuit concerned primarily, there were other issues too, but primarily a provision of the Indiana law that would terminate all state funding to any entity that performs abortions, even though that funding was not being used for abortions. What the state here said was that if with private money you perform abortions, you cannot obtain this Medicaid money. And as a result, Planned Parenthood was faced, its patients were faced, with the inability to obtain this basic care that had nothing to do whatsoever with abortions. Planned Parenthood is providing services in some areas where family planning services are much harder to come by. So the reality is that without Planned Parenthood, it would be more difficult for many low-income women to obtain these services.
Senator, Planned Parenthood is claiming that if they lose this funding, women who need services most, Medicaid women, will not be able to get those services. Do you think that's a valid claim?
Their PR machine is cranking out that rhetoric. But again, Planned Parenthood is not the only one listed on that list. We have, depending on what level of service you want to look at, we have anywhere between 100 to 800 clinics, physicians' offices, hospitals that receive Medicaid, can offer those kinds of services to women. In fact, we had a clinic in the southern part of the state who has been requesting to be on the list to receive Medicaid or to be able to provide Medicaid services to poor and indigent women. They've been blocked from that list because the number of providers were booked. There are providers out there. We have not limited that.
So there's kind of a waiting list?
There's clinics on there that are waiting. Wow. Absolutely.
That's a far cry from what we're hearing.
Oh, yeah.
It's been reported from the governor's office, actually, that there are over 800 Medicaid providers in Indiana. So why do taxpayers need to fund Planned Parenthood also?
Well, taxpayers need to fund Planned Parenthood because under the Medicaid Act, Indiana has to guarantee that patients have what's called freedom of choice, the ability to choose their practitioners. And Indiana does not have the right, as the federal court has found in this case in the preliminary injunction context, does not have the right to deselect providers here or deselect providers there.
We're talking about 800 different facilities that provide those kinds of services.
Well, not necessarily.
We've seen a map, and it's very comprehensive throughout Indiana. So,
well, I would disagree with the map.
I'm not sure how you make the argument that women wouldn't have access to service without Planned Parenthood.
Well, I would disagree with the map, but in any event, that's not the relevant point. The relevant point is that Indiana simply cannot do what it's done.
So it's really not an issue then of them not being able to secure those services.
Well, I think for some it would be difficult, but however, freedom of choice, that's the name of the provision in the federal law, requires that the state stay away from, as I said, this deselection process, regardless of whether there are other providers.
Well, there are those who are arguing that Planned Parenthood's action violates the 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States that allows states to determine this tax funding. They say that Planned Parenthood's actions violates the sovereignty of Indiana and unconstitutionally replaces the state's discretion with that of the court's judgment.
Indiana doesn't have to accept Medicaid. I mean, you've asked me all these questions about why doesn't Planned Parenthood do other things. Indiana can just tell the federal government, sorry, we don't want Medicaid anymore. Perfectly legal. You don't have to take Medicaid. Indiana has agreed to take Medicaid because, obviously, the federal government will underwrite the large majority of those health care costs. But there are certain promises that Indiana made in order to enter the Medicaid program. And one of those promises is this, to allow patients to obtain services from who they want.
Since the law was blocked, Senator Schneider has seen a great deal of pushback from citizens in favor of defunding Planned Parenthood. They found a majority of Indiana citizens don't want their tax dollars funding an organization as controversial as Planned Parenthood, especially in light of recent undercover investigations.
If I set up an appointment, are they going to ask me how long my birthing is? Because he told me that if people found out the date, then it would be very mad at him.
We don't ask anything about abortion. We don't really care about what the age of the birth was consensual. It's your choice.
Because he was a lot older.
So he's a lot older.
He's 31. I don't care how old he is.
Well, recently, Planned Parenthood has gotten a lot of publicity, and frankly, it hasn't been too good. There has been an undercover investigation that actually showed Planned Parenthood on video violating federal law as it pertains to minors under 14 having sex with an adult. Now, under state law with Indiana, they define that as child molestation. Understandably, the people of Indiana are probably upset that funding is going to an organization that was caught trying to violate this law, wouldn't you say?
Well, I don't think that what you're telling me is something that was documented in Indiana. And again, what we're talking about is...
Actually, it was documented in Indiana.
What we're talking about is a law that strips the ability to provide necessary medical care.
But back to the initial question, do you see how, or do you anticipate a pushback from the people of Indiana, considering this recent PR scandal with the video and undercover investigation? Do you expect some pushback from the people that would be understandably upset, showing a Planned Parenthood facility trying to skirt the law?
Well, again, I'm not agreeing that there was any sort of scandal, and what we're talking about is basic federal requirements, which federal court has already determined that Indiana has likely to have violated, which is why they issued a preliminary injunction.
As a matter of fact, from the podium on the floor of the Senate, I discussed several of the investigations into Planned Parenthood that have happened in the state of Indiana. They've had an Attorney General's investigation. They've had the prosecutor in Marion County investigate, and based on charges that were brought to Planned Parenthood on behalf of victims, and as a result of these videos by Lila Rose and her organization. Clearly giving misinformation to young women, skirting the law, and even in some cases grossly breaking the law in terms of disclosure of the age and the condition or the nature of the relationship. So yes, there's not a lot of virtue in what Planned Parenthood has been doing here in Indiana.
In a moment, we'll learn about the growing movement of other states to defund Planned Parenthood.
Whether you're a student needing answers, a parent needing help, or a concerned citizen wanting to make a difference, Life Issues Institute has the resources you need to put your values into action. Life Issues Institute is an international educational organization committed to protecting innocent human life. Life Issues Institute knows what it takes. That's why millions throughout the world turn here for help. Life Issues Institute has authored more pro-life publications than any other entity in the world, and its materials are printed in over 30 languages. Radio broadcasts, newsletters, and a website filled to the brim with the answers you're looking for are just a click away. Go to facinglife.tv and click on the link to Life Issues Institute to find out more about how you can change the heart of a nation.
Julaine Appling is president of Wisconsin Family Action and has been working for years to have Planned Parenthood's funding cut from Wisconsin's state budget. This past year, the legislature reduced tax funding for the agency by $1 million. Julaine and pro-life citizens of Wisconsin were happy fewer of their tax dollars would go to support the nation's largest member of the abortion industry.
The governor's recommendation was just pitch the whole thing out. He just struck the whole $2 $2 million a year, $4 million a 2-year cycle. However, when the Joint Finance Committee got a hold of it, they just couldn't bring themselves to pitching the whole thing right out. So what they did was they reduced the amount by 10%, renamed the program to Women's Health, but what they did to stop it going to Planned Parenthood is they said they were going to give the money to the counties, but the counties could not give that money to any organization that performed abortions or referred for abortions or had affiliates that performed abortion or referred for abortions.
Do you know how those funds will be reallocated?
Well, they'll be reallocated now to organizations that have a proven record of truly doing women's health care. You know, they'll do some of the standard reproductive type tests and for health care, and which, you know, again, the proven track record is Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin performed none.
What kind of pushback was there from Planned Parenthood after this?
What they're trying to say is that the sky is falling for poor women in Wisconsin. There will be no access to women's health care because Planned Parenthood doesn't have this money. No, that's not true. That money is going to be redirected into other entities, as I said, whether it's pregnancy resource centers or county health departments or hospitals that qualify or clinics or whoever might qualify in a community.
Now, Planned Parenthood could receive all this funding if they just stopped doing abortions. Why don't they just get out of the abortion part and all the controversy that it brings and welcome that money back in?
Well, you know, actually that question was asked on Wisconsin Public Radio on an interview. If you really want the money, why don't you just stop the abortions, because that's all that has to happen. And there was basically no response. Planned Parenthood is not going to stop the abortions. The abortions are where they make their money.
The victories in Indiana and Wisconsin are encouraging a number of other states to pass similar bills to cut funding from the abortion industry giant. New Hampshire, Kansas, and North Carolina have all passed legislation. This momentum could be a response to the failed federal effort to defund Planned Parenthood. With the Obama administration acting as a supporter of the abortion industry, it's up to the states to take the reins on this issue.
I think our legislature realized we're going to have to pick up the ball and carry it to the end zone on this issue, which is what we did and several other states have done. And I think we're hearing within the community that other states are going to be planning on doing this next year as well.
So do you think what's happening here in Indiana, in Kansas, North Carolina, New Hampshire, and other places around the country is going to help your efforts in Wisconsin? It's
Contagious. And it emboldens when you can look around and say other states have done this, even with this lawsuit that Indiana has. It's not formidable enough. And you know, it's interesting. Lawsuits are the way that pro-abortion advocates, it's their last resort.
Now that the law has been at least temporarily blocked in Indiana, what's the likelihood of the same things happening in other states where defunding bills have passed?
I don't